Patrick has shown me his watch, so I'm just going to check him out with my own watch, because I've had chairs before who've actually tried to get me to sit down before my time was up. Has that ever happened to you?
I'm not going to be trying to cheat you.
So I'm going to...
Big clock right here.
Can everybody else see that besides you? Okay, I'm not sure which glasses I need. So I'll start with these ones. Larry, I think it must be just about exactly 7 years ago, wasn't it, when many of us here were at your dad's funeral in Toronto. And that was also a celebration of Dan's life, no doubt, but it was a funeral. It was tinged with sadness, more than tinged, as a funeral inevitably is. And of course, we all still miss Dan very much, but I think today's should be pure celebration. It's the sadness can be put aside, the missing can be put aside for now, although I saw a lot of people crying in the last hour. Also in this session, besides celebrating Dan, at least the instructions I got were to discuss the activism in the past. I'm just going to trace the other classes. For those of you who haven't reached this stage yet, don't worry, you will. With luck. To discuss the activism of the past and perhaps find some lessons for the present. And Barbara did that already, and I'm going to continue in that tradition. I've got to admit some full disclosure. like my friend Don Simpson, I was not associated with Dan as an activist. I did, however, supply my activist credentials to Frank, but because you took too long over your coffee and cookies, Patrick didn't have time to tell you what a wonderful activist I once was. But I didn't do it with Dan. We met on a Black History panel at Hart House, and I was trying to find the year, and I think it might have been 1972. I had just begun teaching Black history at the University of Waterloo. I began there in September 71, and I think I was still in my first year as a teacher. The other panelist was Lincoln Alexander. Boy, was I outgunned, can you imagine? I'm sitting there between Dan Hill and Lincoln Alexander. Lincoln, at the time, was a member of Parliament. Anyway, Dan and I found we had many interests in common, and I'm never quite sure why he picked me up. Perhaps, I do have an adopted black son, and that was one of your father's causes. And I think perhaps that's why he found me interesting. But certainly what we did was we talked. Alan is going to regale us, I'm sure, with reminiscences of shared adventures with Dan. All we ever did together was talk. Our sit-ins were over conversation. So with me, at least, Dan was always more the scholar than the activist. And I would say from that perspective, and it's been mentioned already today, that Dan's whole career was infused with scholarship, with research. Look at how carefully he researched everything he said, everything he did, everything he wrote, when he was at the Human Rights Commission, when he was Ombud, in his private practice. If you look at at least the things he used to talk about with me when he was doing it, he wasn't organizing rallies, he was doing research projects mostly during that period when he had the consultancy. From my relationship with him, I would say that Dan was certainly an activist, but not a radical. Donna was much more, and is much more radical. In fact, Dan once told me when we were chatting that he felt uncomfortable with the testing process. If that's not a familiar term with you, I'm going to explain it when I'm talking a little bit in a few minutes. He was certainly an integrationist, as a quick look at his family will tell you, at his wife and children. And not, however, an assimilationist, because he was very concerned to preserve a black identity and culture here in Ontario, and most notably, I suppose, to the OBHS, which he and his wife, Donna, were so instrumental in bringing about. Don was very positive about human rights. I'm not sure whether the term triumphalist is always meant to be an insult, but if I use triumphalist for Dan Hill with his approach to human rights, I don't mean it as an insult, I mean it positively. For Dan, human rights were a solution, and their history was one of progress and achievement. At least conversationally, that was true. I heard a luncheon speech a little while ago. I was in Winnipeg, and it was one of the people involved with the new Human Rights Museum there. And the speaker was at a Rotary Club or something. I wasn't a member. I was invited along. The speaker apologized in advance. He said, "I'm sorry to spoil your lunch, but I'm going to talk about human rights." Can you imagine Dan apologizing for talking about human rights? You know, there's a new book, which I haven't read, but there's an ad for it in the current issue of the New York Review of Books. The book is called The Atlas of Human Rights, and there's a little blurb underneath, as there always is. And this Atlas of Human Rights is, according to the blurb, is about atrocities around the world. Well, that wasn't, I mean, of course, this is the atrocities that attract the attention, but that's not the human rights. Those are the human wrongs. And Dan was about human rights. And he carried that same approach into his writing on African Canadian history, which I'm sure will be reflected in the remarks later this afternoon. A little over a month ago, I was in Dresden, Ontario for a ceremony unveiling an Ontario Heritage Plaque to Hugh Burnett and the National Unity Association. In my remarks at that ceremony, I referred to the two most heroic periods in Ontario history, and I don't say Ontario Black history, I say in Ontario history, these are the two most heroic periods. One was the arrival and settlement of the fugitive slaves or formerly enslaved Americans fleeing here in the 19th century, pioneering. The other came 100 years later when their descendants in the 1940s and 50s were struggling for their basic human rights. And Dan was associated with both those great heroic moments in our history as a human rights activist in the later period and as an innovative historian writing about the earlier period. Have I just got louder?
No, it's just...
Okay, I won't worry about it. In fact, in the Dresden story, Donna was in fact more directly involved than Dan was, as she was in several campaigns in the early 1950s. And so, in fact, my focus today is going to be more on Donna. I thought she was going to be here, frankly, and so in a way I was speaking to her. I told Larry this morning that I'll type these notes up into a proper prose and send it off to Donna. I take my clue from the blurb, from the little booklet that we got, saying the part of the program that begins, he and his wife Donna helped to build. And so I'm going to talk as much about Donna perhaps as Dan. They were a genuine partnership, as we've heard already. Not long after Dan died, I was talking to Donna, and I asked her how she was doing, and she said, I'm busy trying to reinvent Donna Hill. For the previous 50 years, she and Dan had operated in tandem, and what a team. We've heard about it already today, and you're going to hear more about it all day, I'm sure. Of course, we had rights in Ontario before Dan and Donna arrived. If you owned a restaurant in Dresden, you had a right to refuse service to Hugh Burnett just because he was black. If you managed the William Pitt Hotel in Chatham, Ontario, you had a right to refuse service to Alvin Ladd just because he was black. If you ran the concessions for fishing boats at Mitchell's Bay, you could refuse service to Hugh Burnett and Dan Hill, who went there together on a fishing expedition, trying to get, not for fish, trying to collect evidence during the formative period of the human rights movement in this province. Reference has already been made to this notion of a revolution. What Dan and Donna both participated in was a revolution. It was a conceptual revolution, a Copernican revolution, really. It changed things around, it changed hundreds of years of legal and social practice, so that the holder of rights in Ontario was no longer the discriminatory proprietor, but the ordinary citizen, protected eventually and increasingly by the Human Rights Commission, which of course Dan was which he was the first director. I thought I might spend a few minutes, better not make them very long, more than a minute, discussing to understand how revolutionary it was, we have to know what they were up against in circa 1950. For centuries, our traditional British freedoms had included freedom of speech and freedom of association. And freedom of speech was interpreted to mean that you could say anything you wanted to about a group. Jews are crooked, blacks are lazy, Japanese are sneaky. These were some of the ones that went around. And you could post a sign on your property or put an advertisement in the newspaper saying, no Jews or whites only. Okay, well, you know how important that was for people, I don't need to remind you. Freedom of association was interpreted to mean that you could select your employees or your customers or your neighbors according to any criteria you might wish. Hotels, restaurants, swimming pools, beauty parlors, remember what those were? Rental apartments. You could exclude people on grounds of race, color, or creed. Property covenants were put into deeds so that the property couldn't be rented or sold or even sometimes occupied by certain groups, and in Ontario here it was usually blacks and Jews. Prior to the late 1940s, before the Hills arrived in Toronto, Jews and blacks had been campaigning for rights, for equal access to employment, to accommodation, for trying to shut down the overt hate speech and derogatory public notices. They wrapped their claims in terms like British justice or British fair play. But these concepts came attached to those British freedoms I've just been talking about. It was all one package. In other words, this idiom contained too many contradictions. It didn't work. Only when the newly available idiom of human rights became available did the racialized minorities of Ontario begin securing their equality rights. Now, they wrapped the same demands. If you can follow it through from the 30s and 40s, they wrapped exactly the same demands, but only a different language, and it had much more impact. I'm not suggesting that language change was what worked. It helped, but it certainly wasn't automatic. The groups that were operative, like the ones in which the Hills were involved, had a considerable amount of struggle to carry on with. They grasped the new, this is what Dan and Donna did. They seized this new discourse of human rights. They applied it through coalition building, and they conducted mass publicity campaigns to inform the public, the voters, that something bad was happening in their own province. Now, we've already heard reference to the fact that there was something in Toronto called, and its initial name was, the Toronto Labour Committee Against Racial and Religious Intolerance. It was formed just after the war. It was one of a network of similar committees established and largely funded by the Jewish Labour Committee of Canada and its then director, Coleman Kaplansky. When Donna became the executive secretary of the Toronto Committee, she changed the name, or at least it was changed at her urging, I guess it was Coleman Kaplansky that changed it, to the Toronto Labour Committee for Human Rights. Got it? It used to be the Joint Labour Committee Against Racial and Religious Intolerance, and now it's the Committee for Human Rights, for human rights. Again, a very, very significant language change. Not against anybody, not threatening anything, not accusing anyone. For human rights, in favor of our inherent rights, as recognized in the Universal Declaration that Barbara mentioned, but not yet recognized in Ontario law. The significance of that change was profound and helped the achievement of human rights laws in this province. You see, Larry, your mother's use of language was almost as important, or maybe even more important, than your own has been. The coalition brought together organized labor, the Association for Civil Liberties, the predecessor to the bigger and grander CCLA, and the Jewish community through a body called the Joint Public Relations Committee. It was joint between B'nai B'rith and the Canadian Jewish Congress. Donna worked for this coalition as the director of their Toronto-based activities until the expected arrival of young Dan prompted her departure. Dan Sr., Dan the dad, I guess we got Dan the father, Dan the Son, and there must be a Dan the Holy Ghost somewhere. Dan Hill, the father of Larry and Dan, volunteered with that same group, along with people like Bromley Armstrong and Dennis McDermott, other labor and church representatives. And together they pioneered that tactic of testing. For example, a black couple would seek admission to a club, or a mixed couple in the case of the Hills, which in 1950 Toronto was even worse, and they'd be told it was full. Then a white couple would appear and they'd be told that it was okay, and then they'd go. And what they were trying to do was produce evidence of the fact that discrimination really did exist, because people believed, and I think to some extent sincerely, people living out in Don Mills and so on, believed that discrimination was not an issue here, and I'm sure that's still the case with certain people. There were many such episodes. Now, Donna had experience in the States with CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and they actually they initiated that tactic in the American Civil Rights Movement. And I don't know for sure, if she were here I'd have asked her, maybe we can ask her the next time we see her, whether Donna was in fact the conduit for that kind of tactic, translating it into the Canadian movement. Both Dan and Donna were involved with the Porters Union. After the federal government passed its Fair Employment Practices Act of 1953, Dan helped he was a student at the time, he helped to collect and submit complaints of discrimination against the Porters, discrimination practiced not only by the companies, the railroads, but by the railway unions. And in 1954, reference was made to the Harry Gary book. Donna joined with the Porters and with a group called the Negro Citizenship Association to lobby for the application of human rights to our immigration policy. There were many barriers to people's lives in Ontario and Canada, but perhaps the biggest barrier was getting into the country at all at that time in the early 1950s, and that was one of the causes that Donna picked up. She wrote the brief that they took up with her, and she got it endorsed by about 20 different groups, using the argument of human rights and also the new Commonwealth. It seems almost quaint today. This was 1954. She talked about the new Commonwealth, and people coming from the West Indies were in fact British subjects, just like us, and therefore they should be admissible to the country. By the way, the Minister of Immigration, a man named Walter Harris at the time, promised them he would eliminate racism from the Immigration Act in 1954. He said that. Now, there were some modifications, brought some great citizens to Canada through things like the domestics scheme, which Jean Augustine came to Canada under. So there were some positive results, but as we know, racism was not, unfortunately, eliminated through that. I was going to elaborate, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's 15, right? So I've got 5 left.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I thought I might elaborate just a bit on the Dresden campaign as an example, as a sort of a case study of how these things worked. And perhaps by looking at some of these details, or the number of details I'm going to give you, we'll see whether there is any relevance for today. The black people down there in Dresden formed Chatham and North Buxton in the region, formed an organization called the National Unity Association. John Cooper over here has written a very nice book for, I think, for adolescents, is it? It's intended for younger readers anyway, to conduct a campaign to eliminate the discrimination they faced. They went to their town council and asked for a bylaw. The town council thought, oh, this is a bit too big for us, and so we'll put it to the people. So they had a vote on it, a referendum, on whether or not the practice of discrimination in the town, which was pretty absolute, should be interfered with with a bylaw. And this went to the vote in December 1949, and the people of Dresden voted not to interfere. In other words, they voted to continue the right to discriminate, the right of a proprietor to discriminate, by a ratio of about 5 to 1, which was about the ratio of white to black in the city of Dresden. That was a secret ballot, so we don't know who was voting for what, but I'll leave it to you to guess. Well, with that vote, it really hit the fan, and the coalition I mentioned before, the Association for Civil Liberties and elsewhere, put together a major campaign and were able to get the Fair Employment Practices Act put through the Ontario legislature in 1951. But that wasn't really what the National Unity was after. Hugh Burnett vainly tried to have accommodation put into the act, and he received a letter, which I've seen from the Premier's executive assistant, saying the matter would be given every consideration. Well, it wasn't. So exclusion from accommodation was brought back into the public by Donna Hill. It happened like this. Alban Ladd, whose name I mentioned already, who was at the time vice president of the National Unity, went to the William Pitt Hotel in Chatham with a group of union buddies after a union meeting. Everybody else was white except Alban. The whites were served and Alban was not. And so National Unity decided that they would lay a charge under the LLB, Liquor Licensing Act, I guess it would have been. And they came to Toronto to propose that the William Pitt Hotel should serve whoever came. Donna heard about it. She threw a press conference, and that same weekend, this was in December, by now I'm talking about December 1953, that same weekend there was a CCF convention. So Donna went and grabbed Donald MacDonald out of the convention, told him about it, and he held a press conference, and so the story really took off. That's December 53, and the coalition wrote to the Premier saying, we would like to have a Fair Accommodation Practices Act passed in this province. They got no answer to their letter. So Donna and the others, Irving Himmel, people like that, whose names you might know, Ben Kafitz, launched a major publicity campaign. They had churches, they had unions, they had the Nurses Association, they had every little club you can think of, passing resolutions and sending letters to the Premier of the province. You can find them, or many of them, the ones I've looked at are in the archives, where I'm lost, but somewhere within 100 or more, right there, 100 or more yards from where we are now, you can see some of those letters of support that Donna had roused out of the bushes. People claimed to be shocked to learn what they were learning from Donna and her colleagues. Finally, Frost decided, he called them together in March. The speech from the throne was in February with no reference to this. He called them together in March. Donna had to put together a brief in a matter of a day or two. She found 70 other organizations which would endorse it, and they went and presented it as a group to Mr. Frost, Premier Frost. When they got there, they discovered to their surprise that the entire cabinet was there to hear them. Got a very positive, polite response. 5 days later, the Premier himself introduced the Fair Accommodation Practices Act. Now, a few years ago, back when you could still find survivors from the Frost cabinet, I interviewed this was about 25 years ago, I interviewed every surviving member of the Frost cabinet. They all told me that this was unique to have a law put together in 5 days and passed as a government measure. This shows you how quickly or how absolutely Premier Frost and the cabinet were convinced. I don't think by the arguments. I think they were convinced by the public demand for change, because this looked like it could be an electoral issue. I see that your clock has given me about a minute, so can I take that minute?
Sure.
And talk about some of the lessons, maybe? First, you need a definition of your problem. For the activists of the 50s, the problem was perceived as the individual violator, the proprietor who refused to serve blacks. And the solution derives from your problem definition, obviously. So they campaigned for legislation to restrict those bad people, to make it illegal. And once illegal, it becomes a teaching point, and you can say, good people don't do things like that. Barbara mentioned the original code, the 1962 code. If you look at it, in section 4, it says, no person shall discriminate, and then it lists the things you're not allowed to discriminate against. It was intended that, if you look at that solution, you see what the problem was that they were solving. No person shall discriminate. It wasn't aimed at systemic discrimination. That came, as Barbara's already said, a decade or more later. Next, you have to frame your claim in a language that that resonates with your public, that doesn't seem ridiculous or perhaps too radical. What they did, that's what Dan and Donna did. Then you form coalitions with like-minded groups, victims groups or anybody else who shares your principles. And finally, you generate publicity through public education by aiming at the hearts and minds of the general population. Let me cut to the final paragraph. That's not even a paragraph, it's not written out. The path has been pointed out to us by Dan and Donna. And today we honor them as outstanding pathfinders in our journey toward racial equality in Canada. For, we don't need to be reminded, we're not there yet. As Dan might put it, we are freedom seekers still. Okay, that's 20 minutes, how close?
That's pretty good.